Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. In Psalms 119, we have the psalmist speaking very highly of God's law. And he describes it in various ways. He calls it the law. He also calls it the testimonies, the ways, the precepts, the statutes, the commandments, the judgments, and ordinances, the word. He describes it in many different ways, but in all the descriptions, it's always in a lofty and exalted way. He really loves God's law, and he loved to be in God's law, and to follow God's law, and to meditate on God's law. The psalm just pours forth love and adoration towards God's commandments. And you have this beautiful picture painted of the law in Psalms 119. But something happens when you get to the New Testament. When you get to the New Testament and you listen to or you read books such as Romans and Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, Hebrews, you get to these various books in the New Testament, it almost feels like another picture is being painted of the law, a picture that isn't quite so pretty. For instance, in Romans 3, verses 19 and 20, it tells us that the law brings about accountability in sin. In Romans 7 and verse 5, it says that the law arouses sinful passions. In verse 9 of Romans 7, it says that it gives life to sin and brings death to man. In Galatians 2:16 and chapter 5 and verse 4, it says that we cannot be justified by the law. In chapter 3 and verse 22 of Galatians, it says that the law has shut up everyone under sin. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15, it says that the law brought enmity between the Jews and the Gentiles. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14, it calls it the decrees that were against us. And then in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 2, it said that it was a law that could never make us perfect. And so you read these various passages of Scripture in the New Testament, you might think, is there a contradiction here? The psalmist is saying that the law is wonderful, beautiful, something to be desired, something to be longed for, and something for us to want to follow and to be directed by. But the New Testament shows all of these bad things that come from the law. So is there a contradiction between these two? Well, we have to give an absolute answer of no. There is no contradiction. As we read more closely in the New Testament, what we find is that the problem is not with the law. The problem is with us. We are the problem. A really good passage that illustrates this is Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, where it says, "For if that first covenant," talking about the law, "if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second." Now, verse 7 makes it sound like maybe the old law was with fault, because he says, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would not have been no occasion sought for a second. And his whole point is that there has been a second covenant given. But the key is in the very next verse, in verse 8, where he says, "For finding fault with them, he says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I'll effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." It says, for finding fault with them. It was the people who had the fault. It was the people who were at fault, and it was the people who made the law ineffective. The law is good and perfect and right, but we are sinful, rebellious, deficient, and therefore that which is good becomes that which is evil to us. In Romans chapter 7, this idea is brought out. Romans chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. It says, "So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and good." All right, so Paul here is saying that the law is holy, righteous, and good. Then he goes on and explains in verse 13, "Therefore did that which is good become a cause of death for me. May it never be. Rather it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by effecting my death through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin would become utterly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin." Therein lies the problem. We are in the flesh, sold into bondage to sin before coming to Christ. And therefore, we cannot attain to a law that is spiritual, being carnal as we are. And so the problem lies with us. And so as we read Psalm 119, we shouldn't say, well, the psalmist is saying all these great things about the law, but look what the law has brought us. Well, the problem again is not with the law. It's with us, sinful man. So how should we view the law? What do we walk away with? Well, we should regard God's law highly as well. We should join with the psalmist in regarding what God has revealed in a high way. For one, it's because it is the revelation of God's heart. As we look at the old law, we look at the Mosaic law. Some people don't regard the Mosaic law very highly because they think, well, that's the old law. We don't follow the Mosaic law anymore. We walk according to the law of the Spirit, not the law of the letter, so on and so forth. And might think, well, then we can disregard the Mosaic law. But that's not even close to being the case, because even when we go back to the old law, we can gain something from it, because what we find is that it is a revelation of God's own heart. It's a revelation of God's own nature. Now, the type of commandments, the type of laws that are passed by a person reflects the person's own character. If you have, for instance, in our nation, if you have wicked people in Congress, they're going to pass wicked laws. However, if you have just and upright people in Congress, they're going to pass just and upright laws. And so when we go back to the Mosaic law, even, we can see God's heart reflected, His character reflected through the law that He revealed. And so we can hold it in high esteem for that reason, if nothing else. But we can also look at it in a high way because we can see that it is a foreshadow of Christ. Remember, John chapter 1 and verse 1 calls Christ the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Logos, the Word in the flesh. Christ came as the fulfillment of the law. He came to fulfill what the law was leading us to, as Galatians chapter 3 teaches us. And then in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, we see that the law was a shadow, but the substance was Christ. And so like you might see the form of someone through their shadow, what's better to see is the person themselves. And Christ came as the law embodied and as the fulfillment of the law. And so when we look at the old law, we ought to see Christ. We ought to see Christ in every page. We should see Christ in every chapter, because He is, again, the embodiment of the law, the fulfillment of the old law. And so we can hold it in high regard, if nothing else, because of that. So as we consider Psalm 119, let's join with the psalmist in saying how wonderful, how lovely, how pure, how great God's law truly, truly is. And let's also think about how exceedingly sinful we are in light of God's law, and be very thankful that we have Christ, who came and nailed the law that was against us to the tree and gave us a new way to God, a way by faith, and a way in which we could be justified in a way that the law could never do because of the weakness of our flesh. So these are just some things to think about. I do thank you guys for listening in today. Love you guys. Hope you have a great day. God bless.